Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out my first class guide for Shadowlands. You might wonder where I've been for the last month or so, and I've been writing guides that you can find on Wowhead. Also, with the way that Blizzard has been rolling out tiny little class changes every single week, it's sort of hard for me to go, oh, this is the 5% nerf that deserves a breakdown video. Oh no, wait, this is the 5% nerf that deserves a breakdown video. Oh, they just capped Feline Stomp at 5 targets. This deserves a video. You get it. So I decided to just wait until we were right up on the deadline and do a proper guide video for the expansion rather than a preview that probably would have just been outdated before I could even get it finished uploading. So anyway, this is all based off of the Wowhead Brewmaster Monk guide, which I also wrote. So if you want a written version or maybe just some extra detail that I didn't go into in this video, you can read that guide as well. You could also just ask a question in the comments section. I will be doing my best to respond to everyone who has questions about the changes that seem to still be going on even as we're very, very close to the release of Shadowlands. Also, like and subscribe. There we go. Now it's officially a YouTube video. That's enough intro. Let's get right to it. First question, as always, why play Brewmaster Monk? The simple answer is they're good and they're safe. There's not a lot more to add to that, really. They have a simple play style that's pretty easy to learn. They are very tanky, easily the best tank at smoothing damage intake. They don't really require a ton of complex cooldown management for the most part, and finally, they're just super mobile. All of those things combine to make Brewmasters a tank that really doesn't have any significant weaknesses. There are things other tanks can do better, like dealing damage or self-healing, and sometimes mechanics like Spell Reflection or Anti-Magic Shell or Divine Shield can trivialize a mechanic that monks might hate dealing with. But generally speaking, there's almost nothing a monk can't do at least as well as another tank. Okay, now to the fun stuff. Covenants. This all, of course, is still subject to change due to Blizzard just really liking to make changes at the absolute last minute. I wouldn't be surprised if they make big Covenant changes after we're already locked in and started grinding. Oh well, nothing you can do about it. Let's just go through the Covenants in order of usefulness. Alright, so I had to re-record pretty much this whole section because it changed at the last minute. Kyrian is still maybe the safest bet for number 1, although frankly, it's super close. You could argue that Kyrian is the 3rd place now, maybe. Weapons of Order is a really good all-around cooldown. It's arguably the best Covenant for Windwalker and pretty good for Mistweaver, so if you're the kind of player who tends to play around with your off-specs, Kyrian is going to be a safe choice for them as well. But just speaking for Brewmasters, it's very good, and again, it's very safe. It's a competitive option with Necrolord and Nightfey in terms of adding damage, and while it is a longer cooldown, it's also a much better burst damage cooldown in raid situations, especially when you're trying to hit a DPS requirement or squeeze in as much damage as possible during either an extra damage taken window on a boss, or during a Bloodlust, or during potions, or you get it. Kyrian also has the best signature skill available to tanks, an extra healing potion. Having access to another instant self-healing tool is a really good thing, and while the most dangerous bleeds in Castle Nathria have been flagged as no longer being removed by this potion, there are still some debuffs that you can clear off. It's still really good to have. Again, case in point on things changing last minute, Blizzard finally decided to massively nerf Pelagos earlier today after I had already recorded this video. He still grants an extra 10% mastery that's up for most of the duration of Weapons of Order, and he now grants a baseline 3% magic damage reduction that's up all the time. He also lets you pick 2 potency and 2 endurance conduits, which is the ideal setup for maximizing your throughput. He's still the best option for Kyrian, although maybe not the best soulbind for Brewmasters now anymore. I think that now goes to Naya of the Night Fae. Necrolords are, flip a coin, either the number 1 or the number 2 option, and again, it's so close. It's frustratingly close, in fact. Bone Dust Brew is undeniably a better skill under the right circumstances, and like Weapons of Order, it is a powerful cooldown that adds a lot of damage and defensive value. Apparently Mistweaver monks tend to favor Bone Dust Brew over Weapons of Order, so I guess bear that in mind if you like to play Mistweaver. The biggest advantage that Bone Dust Brew has is its shorter cooldown. Because its cooldown is reduced by Keg Smash and Tiger Palm, it averages out to be around 30 to 35 seconds, which means it's available about 4 times more often than Weapons of Order. Because of that, it's a much more consistently available skill in Mythic Plus, and Mythic Plus tends to be less about raw power than it is about consistency from pack to pack. Being able to have a major cooldown up for every trash pack, sometimes more than once per trash pack if it's particularly nasty, is really, really good. The Necrolord signature skill is pretty mediocre. It basically just lets you channel a shield up before a boss pull or in between trash packs and Mythic Plus. Starting off combat with a decent sized shield is good, but in raid it'll get chewed up in like 1 auto attack. It's just not a huge defensive gain. It's certainly not as useful as the reactive self-heal that the Kyrian potion provides, and you really shouldn't use it while tanking. Because channeling the shield prevents you from dodging, you'll wind up taking more damage than you had prevented. So, not great for tanks. In addition to that, Necrolords also have the Amini Soulbind, which was revamped and nerfed a bit, but is still very competitive with Pelagos due to the incredible power of lead by example for Brewmaster Monks. It's an extra 13% agility that perfectly overlaps with every Bone Dust Brew cast. That's really, really good. The rest of Amini's tree isn't really anything special, but that's fine. Night Fae is up next, and I wish they were a better performing Covenant. They are competitive on paper. I may still wind up playing Night Fae. I'm leaning that way right now. It's legitimately a very difficult decision. Arguably, they are the best option by a tiny margin on AoE fights. The problem is, Phalanx Stomp requires you to stand on the Phaline to trigger resets. This causes 2 issues. First, being forced to move becomes a DPS loss. That's not great. Second, and it's a little harder to quantify, but bear with me, constantly wanting to stand on the Phaline adds a mental tax that isn't present with any of the other Covenants. I don't think it's present with any other Covenant ability for almost any other tank. I guess there's a couple of Necrolord bonuses where you have to stand in a circle for Demon Hunter and Warrior, but those suck for exactly that reason. It's just an extra unnecessary layer of stress. Ultimately, the problem with Night Fae is that because it gets punished so badly by movement, it either needs to deal more damage, or the Phaline needs to be larger, or leaving it has to be more forgiving in some way. Or it just needs a shorter base cooldown. It is tuned to be extremely competitive with the other Covenants under perfect conditions, but the non-perfect conditions are way more forgiving to the other Covenants than they are to Night Fae. You hate to see it. I like this skill a lot. It adds a lot of consistent AoE damage, which monks need. It adds a decent chunk of healing, which is nice. And it adds an occasional boost to your stagger value, which is good defensively. It's a great idea. It's just not the obvious winner, and that is a bummer to me. The best soulbind associated with the Night Fae is Naya, who grants a stacking, non-refreshing mastery and max health buff every time you cast Phalanx Stomp. It's a good source of a ton of extra stat budget, and it does make her soulbind tree feel really rewarding. The rest of her tree is pretty underwhelming, but that's okay. She's worth like 7% more mastery and max health on average, and that rocks. The final thing that holds the Night Fae back is that their signature skill, Soul Shape, is just another mobility skill. More mobility isn't a bad thing, but it's not what monks need. Last up is Vinthier, and their ability Fallen Order is very boring. It's basically just a third on use damage trinket. You use it, it summons minions that attack your enemies and heal you, that's it. This could all be fine, but it's very undertuned. It was extremely bugged for long periods of the beta. It summoned way more monks than it was supposed to. They lasted longer than they were supposed to, and they did more damage than they were supposed to. Once those bugs were all fixed, the ability became pretty underwhelming. It doesn't really have anything interesting going on mechanically anyways, so not being competitive as a DPS skill basically neutralizes it. It is a good burst damage skill at the start of a fight, no question there, but the longer cooldown on it just makes it non-competitive once the other abilities start getting multiple casts, and it doesn't. The best soulbind for Vinthier for tanks is General Draven. He's a pure defensive soulbind. I guess if you wanted more stats or more offensive value, you would go with Theotar the Mad Duke, but really if you wanted more stats and defensive value, you would go with another Covenant. And finally, the signature skill for Vinthier is Door of Shadows, which is basically just a teleport. You can use it to skip past trash packs or blink through boss mechanics, but beyond that, extra mobility, again, just isn't that big of a deal for Monk. Alright, so the quick summary on Covenants is that Kyrian is the simple choice for best all-around option. Necrolord is very close in power, arguably superior, especially in Mythic Plus due to being more reliable. It's just not as good for big burst damage windows in Raid. Ultimately, you really can't go wrong either way. As for Night Fae, they are also very competitive, they just require a lot more work for the same end result, and they do get punished by movement pretty badly. I may have convinced myself to go Night Fae thanks to today's Soulbind nerfs. I'm still not 100% sure, but I'll just say Night Fae is absolutely viable and competitive and very versatile. It's the expert level pick. It may just perform poorly due to movement on some fights, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's harder to be competitive as Night Fae than it is as Necrolord or Kyrian. Anyways, Vinthier isn't competitive, but it is very simple, and I wouldn't really be that surprised if Blizzard does tune it up to be competitive, or even the number 1 DPS after we've already committed to Kyrian, Necrolord, and Night Fae. Alright, I talked about soulbinds and pointed out the best trees, but now let's quickly cover conduits, which fit into the empty sockets in those soulbind trees. There are 3 kinds of conduits. Potency conduits increase your damage and healing, endurance conduits increase your defenses, and finesse conduits are weird. For tanks, you can have 3 potency conduits available to you at a given time, and you can only get up to 2 potency conduit sockets in your soulbind tree. Each of the covenants has a potency conduit that corresponds to the covenant class ability, and then there are 2 generic potency conduits available to Brewmaster Monks, regardless of their covenant choice. So let's just break them down quickly. Scalding Brew looks like the best conduit available to Brewmaster Monks. It passes the eye test. It's a big damage increase to your best skill. That's good, right? No, it is. That's true, but it actually winds up being the weakest potency conduit for increasing your damage, which is all it does, and it should never be used. That feels wrong, but it's right. Walk with the Ox grants extra damage to invoke Nuzal, who is one of your 2 offensive cooldowns. This conduit takes at least 30 seconds off of its cooldown on average, which actually winds up being a pretty substantial DPS increase, more than Scalding Brew. It's not as good as most of the Covenant potency conduits, although it does seem to be better than the Kyrian one. The Kyrian potency conduit is Strike with Clarity. It makes Weapons of Order last an extra 5 seconds, which is okay, and grants a tiny bit more mastery. It's not very good, but you should wear it as your second potency conduit. Bone Marrow Hops is the Necrolord potency conduit. It substantially increases the damage that Bone Dust Brew adds. The cooldown reduction component was capped at 2.5 seconds per Bone Dust Brew cast, so it barely does anything. That's okay, this is still a significant DPS, and it still would be better than Walk with the Ox, even if the cooldown reduction component was completely removed, which it basically was. Way of the Fae is the Night Fae Potency Conduit. It really significantly increases Phaline Stomp's damage output while you're in AoE. It's a good, consistent DPS increase, and it should be your first choice. And finally, Imbued Reflections is the Venthyr Potency Conduit. It increases the damage of Fallen Order by a lot, and is absolutely worth taking to maximize your burst damage. Alright, endurance conduits are, thankfully, a little more straightforward. Harm Denial grants you extra self-healing with Expel Harm. It sounds good, but it doesn't affect the healing you get from your Gift of the Ox Orbs consumed with Expel Harm, so it's not nearly as big of a bonus as it may appear at first glance. It's not very good, but it is the most consistent self-healing increase, so it's the one I would recommend most, but it's pretty competitive with the next option. Celestial Effervescence is the other self-healing option, and it does apply to all self-healing, but only while Celestial Brew is active, which is about 7 seconds duration on a roughly 30-second cooldown. It's arguably the more powerful option of the two, and being sure that you come out of every Celestial Brew with full health or pretty close is fantastic, but a lot of this bonus is also probably going to be wasted on overhealing, and that's not very good. I'll mention Evasive Stride not because it's good, but because it's horrendous. It looks amazing on paper, but the proc rate and use case is so low. This bonus can regularly do literally nothing at all. There was a log circulating the Monk Discord for a while of it getting 1 proc in an entire Mythic Plus run. That's bad. If you're taking really high level Mythic Plus content, it will increase in value and eventually start to become competitive with the other two options. But I'm talking about like 25s and 30s over here. I doubt anyone is going to get close to doing content hard enough to make this conduit good within the first season of Shadowlands. The other two conduits are very forgettable, they don't really do much, so don't use them. And finally, Finesse Conduits. Dizzying Tumble grants a small damage reduction debuff on your enemies after your leg sweep wears off on them. Technically, it's a stronger damage reduction effect than either of the, or any of the endurance conduits, and I guess it's the best finesse conduit available to brewmasters, but it's still really pretty bad. The other finesse conduits are all pretty much meaningless. If you're forced to take one of them, I guess take Dizzying Tumble, but you know, follow your heart. Okay, next up is Legendaries, and there's really only 3 pieces I feel like I need to talk about here. First up, and my personal favorite, is Storm Stout's Last Keg. It's very good and very versatile. You can craft it in your shoulders or your gloves, and you should go with gloves since you can't get Versatility Crit gloves otherwise during the first season of Shadowlands, whereas there are numerous pairs of Versatility Crit shoulders, including a higher than normal item level pair off the next to last boss in Castle Nathria. You get this pattern from the Sanguine Depths dungeon, so you can get it during the first week of the expansion. Basically, this legendary increases the damage of your best skill, it reduces ability collision in the rotation, which makes haste a much more valuable stat in between the 14% and 33% breakpoints, and it just makes the class feel a lot more fun and rewarding to play. Technically, it isn't the best DPS increase in single target, but it is the best in AoE. Charred Passions is the best single target DPS increase legendary, so it will be useful in raids. You get this pattern from Torghast, so you should be able to get it very early on as well, and you should craft it as boots to maximize the stat budget. I don't really have a ton to say about it. It adds damage. It slightly increases your Breath of Fire uptime, but Breath of Fire uptime is already around 80%, so that's not a huge deal. But what can I say? It adds damage, the most damage, and that's great. It's a good offensive legendary. It just doesn't have quite the same all-around appeal or fun factor as Storm Stout's last keg, but it's nice. Last is Mighty Pour, and it's the only good totally defensive legendary for monks. Now, for most players, the defense that this adds is just going to be overkill. There's no reason to use it. But if you're pushing Mythic Plus to really high levels or working on Mythic Raid progression early on in the tier, the extra purifying brew casts that this item can provide will remove a decent amount of damage. Ultimately, I don't think this is a useful legendary for most players. And the pattern drops from the final boss of Castle Nathria, so it won't be available until you've at least completed the raid on some difficulty. That being said, I do want to be complete here and say, this is the best defensive legendary. Alright, now that we've covered all of the new Shadowlands class features, let's just focus on the basics. Ordinarily, I would have started with talents, rotation, etc., but I know what people want to see, I ain't no fool. So here's talents. This is the ideal setup. I don't think it's worth my time or yours for me to go through every single talent in every single tier and say why they're good or bad or ugly or whatever. This is the talent setup that pretty much everyone is going to use for virtually all content. There are some swaps you can make, like switching to Chi Torpedo if you prefer it over Tiger's Lust, switching to Summon Black Ox statue to pick up adds, or using Dampen Harm if you really need an extra defensive cooldown. That's about it. Chi Burst can be useful in AoE, but I don't think it's worth the keybind or the GCD. Black Ox Brew can be useful, but you have to use it on cooldown or you'll lose value on it, and it's much less reliable defensively than just sticking with light brewing. Exploding Keg and Celestial Flames are new, and they're not great. They're not unusable, but they just generally aren't as good as Rushing Jadewind or High Tolerance. The Brewmaster Monk rotation is still pretty simple, although it will have a few important changes. First of all, you have offensive cooldowns baseline now, and you should use them all as much as you possibly can. Generally, you're going to start off combat by running into pull with Rushing Jadewind active, then you'll pop Nijao and your Covenant ability, and then start going into your regular rotation. Also, remember to Touch of Death as soon as it's usable near the end of a fight. There are a few notes here. If you're using Storm Stout's last keg, then you obviously will want to keep one of your charges of Keg Smash on cooldown at all times, but the other one isn't as high of a priority. You can throw out 2 quick Keg Smashes to deal a nice chunk of burst damage, but generally speaking, you're going to just focus on keeping at least one charge on cooldown, then lock in on the other cooldown skills, specifically Blackout Kick and Breath of Fire. Then you'll just want to use your second charge of Keg Smash as more of a filler skill to fit into the gaps in your rotation instead of using Tiger Palm. As for Covenants, the only one that's not just a big cooldown you pop right at, at the start of fights and on cooldown as it comes back up, is Feline Stomp. In AoE, it's just behind Keg Smash, and in single target, it's just behind Blackout Kick. The important thing is that you don't use it ahead of Keg Smash, and you do prioritize it ahead of Breath of Fire and Rushing Jadewind. And the most important thing in your offensive rotation, above everything else, is to make sure you don't overcast Tiger Palm or Spinning Crane Kick. They're filler skills. Tiger Palm deals very little damage and generates a very small amount of defense. Don't use up all your energy overcasting it. Spinning Crane Kick does a good bit more AoE damage than Tiger Palm, obviously, but it's pretty much useless defensively, so don't overdo it there either. Use it to fill empty GCDs with extra AoE damage. That's about it. In terms of defensive skills, the way you use Purifying Brew is very simple. Use it a lot. Don't try to hold on to it and time it well. Just use Purifying Brew every 10 seconds or so, and it will all average out over time. The difference between best case and worst case purifying timing is much, much smaller than it has been in previous expansions. Just chug it. As for Celestial Brew, it's kind of the same thing. There can be situations in which you really do need to hold on to Celestial Brew for a little while to counter some big boss mechanic, but generally speaking, you should just chug it as soon as it's available as well. So, yeah, drink your way to being healthy. Just like me. The basic stat priority for Brewmaster Monk is pretty much the same as it has been for the past couple of expansions. Versatility and critical strike are the most important stats. You want as much of them as you can get. Mastery is okay, but a little less consistent, and haste kind of depends on whether you're running Storm Stout's last keg or not. If you are, it's okay. It's not great, but it is more valuable. If you aren't, it's pretty bad. Ultimately, the most important things to go after in gearing are sockets and item level, then versatility and crit, and then the rest of the stats don't really matter all that much. In terms of notable pieces of gear, most of it is pretty interchangeable. You can dual wield now, and dual wielding is usually the right move since you can double up on weapon enchants. Double lightless force enchants is the best option for dealing damage. Ultimately, running a two-hander isn't a problem, and you should absolutely do it if it's an item level increase, but you can gain a small damage boost from that second weapon enchant, so bear that in mind. As far as damage trinkets go, there are some decent ones from dungeons and raids. Pretty much all of the on-use ones are decent, at least. The two best trinkets from dungeons are Phial of Putrefaction and Shadow Grasp Totem. The two best trinkets from raid are Dreadfire Vessel from Sire Denathrius and Stone Legion Heraldry from the Stone Legion Generals. The Dark Moon decks this expansion aren't great. The DPS one lets you leech haste from your enemy for a 20-second haste buff on a 90-second cooldown. It's pretty bad. The tank one is also a 90-second cooldown, and it grants you a minor, brief defensive cooldown that basically blocks part of the next 5 hits. It's also pretty bad. Neither of them are horrendous if you have a bunch of gold burning a hole in your pocket and you want a quick trinket to get you going, but they aren't great either. I guess I would recommend the defensive trinket if you have to choose, and they are unique equipped, so you do have to choose, but really I would recommend neither. I would actually recommend going alchemy for the alchemy trinket over either of those two, but maybe you don't want to go alchemy, so forget it. All right, I think that about does it. I think we're all pretty excited for Shadowlands. I know I am. Monk is in a great position to start the expansion, and the biggest thing bothering me now is just which covenant I want to be. I think monks are the only tank that has 3 non-controversially competitive covenant options available. I guess it's time to flip a 3-sided coin. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Brewmaster Monks and Shadowlands, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.